In a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood, a mother's love met an unthinkable end. Her son, a former NFL player once full of promise, stood accused of her murder. What drove Devon Hall to kill Alicia Benson? A story of talent, tragedy, and a mind that slowly slipped away. Los Angeles is full of stories about fame, ambition, and heartbreak. But the story of Devon Hall and his mother, Alicia Benson, is one of the most haunting. It's not about money or jealousy, but about mental illness, family love, and how everything can collapse when help arrives too late. What happened between a mother and her son in a quiet neighborhood of Los Angeles County is a tragedy that still leaves people wondering how things went so wrong. Devon Hall was born and raised in Los Angeles. He grew up like many kids who dreamed big. Football was his passion, and by his early 20s, it looked like his dream was coming true. Hall was tall, strong, and determined. Friends and coaches described him as focused, polite, and hardworking. He played college football at Utah State University, where he stood out as a defensive back. His talent caught the attention of NFL scouts. By 2009, Devon had signed with the Minnesota Vikings as an undrafted free agent, later spending time with teams like the Indianapolis Colts and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He was living the kind of life many athletes worked years to reach. But the NFL is a tough world. Hall's career didn't last long. After a few seasons of bouncing between practice squads and short-term contracts, he found himself without a team. Injuries and inconsistent performance made it difficult for him to secure a permanent spot. He returned home to Los Angeles, where life after football was not what he expected. The transition from athlete to regular civilian life hit him harder than anyone realized. Those who knew him began noticing small changes. His energy faded, his speech became erratic, and his confidence slipped away. He stopped keeping in touch with old teammates and rarely talked about his football days. Alicia Benson, his mother, was a proud woman in her late 40s. She worked hard, raised her son mostly on her own, and always believed in him. She had a calm strength that people respected. To her, Devon wasn't just a son, he was her life's purpose. She had supported his football career from day one, traveling to games, cheering from the stands, and defending him through every setback. After he came home from the NFL, she welcomed him with open arms, hoping he'd find a new path and heal from whatever pain he was carrying. But what Alicia couldn't see clearly at first was how deep his struggles had become. Friends who had known Devon in college said that after leaving football, he began to show signs of paranoia and delusion. Some recalled him saying strange things, acting distant, and sometimes talking to himself. He became more withdrawn. Neighbors later told police they sometimes saw him walking up and down the street alone, looking disoriented. Alicia tried to help. She encouraged him to get therapy, to find a job, to stay close to family. But mental illness can be unpredictable, and Devon's condition only worsened. By early 2017, he was living with Alicia again in her modest home in the Windsor Hills area of Los Angeles County. Their relationship was still loving, but increasingly tense. Alicia worried about his hygiene, his eating habits, and his lack of motivation. She reportedly told friends that her son refused to take care of himself, often sleeping all day and barely eating. The house, once filled with family warmth, became quiet and uneasy. She wanted him to get help, but he resisted. On April 24, 2017, that tension reached its breaking point. That day began like many others. Alicia went about her normal routine, while Devon stayed mostly to himself. But at some point that evening, a confrontation began. Alicia entered his room and told him he needed to clean up and take better care of himself. Neighbors would later say they heard raised voices, a heated argument between mother and son. What started as words turned into something violent and tragic. One neighbor reported hearing loud thuds coming from the home, followed by a woman's screams. Then everything went silent. When someone finally stepped outside, they saw Devon in the street, shirtless and pacing. He looked confused, disconnected, and detached from reality. Inside the home, Alicia was on the floor unresponsive. A neighbor called 911, their voice shaking as they described the scene. He hit her, one caller told the operator. He stomped her out. She's not moving. When sheriff's deputies arrived at the house, they found Alicia lying on her back with severe head and facial injuries. Blood was visible on the floor and nearby walls. She was barely breathing. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize her. They quickly realized the extent of her trauma. She had brain swelling, deep bruises, and broken bones. The injuries were consistent with a brutal beating. Outside, deputies found Devon still wandering near the scene. He didn't run or resist. Witnesses said he looked vacant, as if he didn't understand what was happening. Officers approached carefully, handcuffed him, and placed him under arrest. When they asked what had happened, he gave fragmented answers that made little sense. Some reports suggest he was speaking to himself or responding to voices only he could hear. In the hours that followed, neighbors gathered on the street, shocked and confused. Many of them knew Alicia as a kind woman who always smiled and waved. They couldn't imagine something like this happening in their quiet community. News spread quickly. A former NFL player had been arrested for attacking his mother. The headlines drew national attention, but behind the sensational story was something deeper. A story of untreated mental illness, a struggling family, and a system that hadn't been able to intervene in time. At the hospital, doctors worked through the night, but Alicia's condition didn't improve. She remained unconscious, kept alive by machines. Detectives visited the hospital to document her injuries and talk to family members. Meanwhile, investigators began piecing together what had led up to that night. They learned that there had been no previous reports of violence between mother and son. There were no drugs or alcohol involved. What stood out most was Devon's deteriorating mental state. Over the next few days, Alicia's family and friends held onto hope that she would recover. But on April 28th, 4 days after the assault, she died from her injuries. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled her death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the head. When the news reached the community, grief turned to disbelief. How could a young man once celebrated for his athleticism and discipline have ended up here, accused of killing the woman who had devoted her life to him? Former teammates expressed sadness and confusion. Some said they had seen signs of trouble years earlier, but no one imagined it could end this way. By the time Alicia's death was confirmed, Devon was already in custody, facing a murder charge. He was booked into a Los Angeles County jail. Reporters swarmed the story, and his name appeared in every major news outlet. But those who knew him personally didn't see a monster. They saw a man whose mind had unraveled long before that terrible night. Police reports described Devon's behavior during questioning as erratic. He seemed lost, unsure of reality. At one point, he reportedly mumbled things about God and destiny, suggesting that he didn't fully understand what had happened. Detectives began to suspect that his mental health played a central role in the crime. This was not a case about revenge or greed. It was the collapse of a life that had once held promise. A mother tried to care for her troubled son, hoping he'd find his way again. Instead, she became the victim of his illness. The events of that April night marked the beginning of a long and painful legal process, one that would reveal the full extent of Devon's mental decline and the heartbreak of a family that loved him until the very end. As the investigation unfolded, prosecutors prepared their case, while defense attorneys began gathering information about Devon's medical and psychological history. It was clear that his mind was in turmoil. The question that would soon face the court and the public was not just whether he committed the act, but whether he understood what he was doing when it happened. The arrest of Devon Hall left both law enforcement and the community struggling to make sense of what had happened. A young man once praised for his discipline and athletic drive was now behind bars, accused of killing his own mother. The crime seemed impossible to explain through logic alone. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that this was not a story about anger or crime for gain, but about a mind slowly breaking apart. After the night of April 24, 2017, detectives began building a timeline of events leading up to Alicia Benson's death. They spoke to neighbors, relatives, and former teammates to understand the changes in Devon's behavior. The picture that emerged was one of a man whose mental health had been unraveling for years. People who knew him during his football career described him as quiet and humble, the kind of player who followed rules and respected authority. But after football, something in him shifted. The loss of structure, the physical toll of years of hits on the field, and the pressure of an uncertain future seemed to push him into a spiral. By the time he moved back in with Alicia, he was already showing signs of paranoia. Some witnesses said he talked about people watching him or trying to control him. He often isolated himself in his room, staying up late at night and pacing around. It was behavior that worried his mother, but she hoped he'd pull himself together. Alicia's friends later told police that she often confided in them about her son's strange moods. She said he was not himself anymore. He refused medical treatment and rejected the idea of therapy. Still, she couldn't bring herself to force him out or call for psychiatric help. She loved him too much to believe he might be dangerous. When deputies questioned Devon after his arrest, they found him disoriented. His statements drifted between confusion and silence. One detective noted in his report that Hall didn't appear to understand why he was there. He kept referring to tests and voices, suggesting that his thoughts were not grounded in reality. The district attorney's office quickly filed a murder charge, but behind the scenes, even prosecutors were aware that this would not be a straightforward case. The news hit the sports world with shock. Articles appeared in national outlets describing the fall of a former NFL player who had once shown great promise. Reporters revisited his days at Utah State, his time in the league, and his quiet disappearance from professional sports. Some speculated about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, the brain disease linked to repeated head injuries in football players. There was no proof, but it was a question many couldn't ignore. Could years of hits have contributed to his mental decline? Those close to him said that after football, he was never the same. Meanwhile, Alicia's family prepared to bury her. The funeral drew relatives, neighbors, and friends who remembered her as kind and hardworking. Many spoke about her devotion to her son, how she always believed he'd turn his life around. There was grief, but also confusion. No one knew whether to feel anger, sorrow, or pity. It was impossible to separate the man from the illness. In the months that followed, Devon remained in jail while mental health evaluations were ordered. Psychiatrists interviewed him, reviewed his history, and tried to determine whether he understood what had happened. Reports described a man detached from reality, sometimes unresponsive, sometimes speaking to unseen presences. His defense attorney began preparing a case that would argue he was legally insane at the time of the killing. The court proceedings moved slowly. Each hearing brought a new wave of attention. Cameras waited outside the courthouse, reporters calling out questions as he was escorted in. But Devon rarely reacted. He often stared blankly ahead, expressionless. His lawyers described him as calm but unreachable, saying he had moments of clarity followed by confusion. Behind closed doors, doctors debated whether his condition was schizophrenia, a form of psychosis, or something else entirely. The tragedy of the case was undeniable. A mother trying to help her son, and a son whose mind had turned against itself. While the legal system worked through its process, more details about the night of the attack became public. Investigators found no sign of drugs or alcohol in Devon's system. There was no evidence of premeditation. It wasn't a planned act. It was sudden, explosive, and senseless. A moment of confusion had turned into deadly violence. Detectives believed the argument over hygiene and living conditions may have triggered something deeper in his mind, a break from reality. During questioning, when detectives asked why he had hurt his mother, his answers made little sense. He spoke in fragments, mentioning destiny, cleansing, and protection. It was as if he believed he was acting under some greater command, not out of anger or will. That interview was one of the first major signs that his mind was not functioning normally. As months passed, the prosecution faced a dilemma. They had a confession of sorts and physical evidence, proving Devon caused his mother's death, but it was equally clear that he was mentally unwell. The question became not whether he did it, but whether he was responsible in the legal sense. In American law, that meant determining if he understood right from wrong at the time of the act. Psychiatrists conducted competency hearings to decide if he was fit to stand trial. By 2019, after multiple psychiatric evaluations, experts agreed that Devon Hall suffered from a severe mental disorder. Some reports pointed to long-term psychosis, others to possible trauma from head injuries. Both sides accepted that his state of mind at the time of the crime was profoundly impaired. The court then ordered a formal trial to determine criminal responsibility. As the proceedings continued, the story of Devon's downfall drew comparisons to other athletes whose lives were derailed by mental illness and the pressure of post-football life. Journalists revisited the theme of identity loss, how athletes who define themselves through sport often struggle once that chapter closes. Without structure, fame, or purpose, some fall into depression or instability. Devon's story seemed to be one of the darkest examples. Alicia's family attended court sessions quietly. They wanted justice, but they also wanted understanding. Her relatives told reporters that Alicia had been a loving mother until her last breath. They believed she died trying to help her son. It was a painful truth. She saw the signs of his collapse, but couldn't save him from it. As experts testified, the details became clear. Devon had been living in confusion, paranoia, and delusion long before that night. His mental decline had gone untreated. Friends later said he would talk about people following him or hearing voices. Some remembered him wandering the streets, disoriented, dressed in layers even in summer heat. These stories painted a tragic portrait of a man who needed medical help, not prison. In jail, Devon remained calm and mostly silent. Guards described him as polite but distant, a man living in his own world. When asked if he remembered the attack, he struggled to give a coherent answer. The more doctors spoke with him, the more it became clear that his grip on reality had been fragile for years. By the end of 2019, the case was approaching a turning point. The evidence of his guilt was undeniable, but so was the evidence of his insanity. The courtroom was divided between two truths: that a woman had been killed, and that her son may not have been capable of understanding his actions. The next phase of the case would determine his fate and bring the story to its final and heartbreaking conclusion. By early 2020, nearly 3 years after Alicia Benson's death, the long legal process finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom in Los Angeles was quiet when Devon Hall was brought in, thinner and calmer than before. Gone was the young man once celebrated for his strength on the football field. Now he looked lost, his eyes heavy and distant. The public had followed his case since the night of the killing, but few knew how severe his mental collapse had been. What had started as a story of violence had become a story about mental illness, justice, and the limits of accountability. The final hearings focused on 2 questions. Was Devon sane when he killed his mother? And what would justice look like for a man who had destroyed his family but seemed trapped inside a broken mind? The prosecutors presented the facts of the case: how Alicia had been beaten so badly she couldn't survive, and how her son had been the only one in the house that night. They spoke of the brutality, the loss, and the community's grief. But even as they recounted the crime, their tone carried a note of sadness rather than vengeance. Everyone in the room knew this was not a simple murder case. Psychiatrists who had examined Devon over the previous 2 years took the stand. They described his mental state in clinical but heartbreaking detail. One doctor said he lived in a fragmented reality, hearing voices and seeing threats that weren't there. Another explained that Devon believed his mother was part of a vision, that something inside him told him to act. They agreed he was suffering from severe psychosis during the attack, unable to distinguish right from wrong. His thoughts were disordered, his sense of self dissolved. He had not planned to harm his mother, nor did he understand the consequences of his actions. The medical evidence painted a picture of a man disconnected from the world around him. The defense built its case around these findings. They argued that Devon's actions were the tragic result of an untreated mental illness, possibly worsened by years of head trauma from football. His lawyer reminded the court that Alicia had tried to get him help, that she loved him deeply and never saw him as a threat. He emphasized that Devon had no criminal record, no pattern of violence, and no motive beyond the confusion in his mind. The defense wasn't asking the court to excuse the killing, but to understand it for what it was, a moment of madness, not malice. The prosecution, while acknowledging his illness, insisted that society still needed protection. They asked the court to ensure Devon would never again be in a position to harm anyone. They pushed for his commitment to a secure psychiatric facility where doctors could monitor him indefinitely. In their closing argument, they said this was a tragedy without villains, only victims. When it was time for the judge's ruling, the courtroom was still. Family members of both Alicia and Devon sat side by side, united in their grief. The judge spoke slowly, reviewing the evidence, the testimonies, and the psychiatric evaluations. Then he delivered his decision. Devon Hall was not guilty by reason of insanity. He would not serve time in prison. Instead, he would be confined to a state mental hospital under medical supervision. The ruling meant that the court recognized he had committed the act, but was legally incapable of understanding it when it happened. There was no applause, no outburst. Just silence. Alicia's family wept quietly. It was a complicated kind of justice, one that didn't erase the pain, but acknowledged the truth. Devon's fate was sealed not by punishment, but by treatment. He would spend years, maybe the rest of his life, in a locked psychiatric facility, receiving care that should have come long before that fatal night. In the weeks after the verdict, reporters revisited the story. They called it a warning about mental health, about how easily the system fails those who need help most. Commentators pointed to the pressures faced by athletes after leaving professional sports, the identity loss, the loneliness, and the lack of mental health support. Some raised the issue of head trauma and brain injuries that can lead to personality changes and psychosis. But for Alicia's loved ones, the medical explanations offered little comfort. They had lost a mother, a sister, and a friend. The son she loved more than anyone was alive, but in many ways, gone too. Devon's time in the state hospital marked the end of the legal story, but not the end of the tragedy. Visitors described him as quiet, polite, but detached. He rarely talked about what happened. Sometimes he asked for his mother, not remembering that she was gone. Doctors continued to treat him for schizophrenia and psychosis, hoping to keep him stable. Whether he truly understood what he had done remained uncertain. The story of Devon Hall and Alicia Benson is a reminder of how fragile the line between love and tragedy can be. It began as a story about a young man chasing a dream and a mother who stood behind him through every struggle. It ended with a broken family and a courtroom verdict that balanced mercy with sorrow. In the end, the case was not about guilt or innocence. It was about loss, the consequences of untreated mental illness, and the painful truth that sometimes love alone isn't enough to save someone from themselves. Los Angeles has seen countless crime stories, but few as heartbreaking as this one. Behind the headlines about an ex-NFL player who killed his mother lies something deeply human. A story of a son who needed help, a mother who tried to give it, and a system that realized too late what was happening. The tragedy of Alicia Benson and Devon Hall will always stand as a quiet reminder that mental illness, when ignored, can destroy the very bonds it depends on most. In the quiet suburb of Maywood, Illinois, a chilling mystery unfolded when former NFL star Sergio Brown vanished, and his 73-year-old mother was found dead near their home. What began as a family tragedy soon exposed a dark story of fame, betrayal, and unanswered questions that stunned the nation. It began in the quiet suburb of Maywood, Illinois, a neighborhood lined with modest homes, old trees, and people who mostly knew one another by name. It was here, in September 2023, that a tragedy unfolded that would shock the community and later capture national attention. The case involved former NFL player Sergio Brown and his 73-year-old mother, Myrtle Simmons Brown, a woman described by neighbors as gentle, active in her church, and deeply proud of her family. By all outward appearances, they were close, a mother and son who shared a home and a long bond built through years of shared experiences. But behind that familiarity, something dark was building, and no one around them could have imagined how it would end. Sergio Brown was well known in Maywood long before the headlines. He was in his mid-30s, athletic, confident, and known as the hometown success story who made it to the NFL. Born and raised in the area, he had graduated from Proviso East High School and gone on to play college football at Notre Dame before signing with the New England Patriots. His professional career took him to teams like the Indianapolis Colts, Jacksonville Jaguars, and Buffalo Bills. Even after retirement, people in Maywood remembered him as the local kid who made it big. Myrtle, on the other hand, was a beloved community member, often seen tending to her garden or chatting with neighbors on her porch. To those who knew her, she was kind and maternal, the sort of woman who looked out for others. The Browns lived together in a tidy single-family home on the 1100 block of Chicago Avenue. It wasn't unusual for Sergio to be back and forth between places, but that September, neighbors noticed odd behavior. Some said Sergio seemed different, erratic, loud, and at times paranoid. There were reports of him acting strangely in public, yelling that the FBI was after him, or posting odd messages on social media. Myrtle, however, kept a calm presence. Friends said she seemed worried but protective of her son, who had returned to live with her more permanently. No one expected the situation to spiral into violence. The evening of September 14, 2023, appeared ordinary at first. Surveillance footage later, retrieved from the Browns' home, showed Myrtle alive that day. Nothing on the camera suggested an immediate threat. But by the next morning, things had taken a grim turn. Myrtle's relatives hadn't heard from her, and her phone went unanswered. When days passed with no contact, the family grew alarmed and called the Maywood Police Department for a welfare check. Officers arrived at the property on September 16th. What they found sent shockwaves through the community. Behind the house, near a small creek that ran along the property line, officers discovered Myrtle Brown's body. She was partially covered with leaves, dressed in her nightclothes. The Cook County Medical Examiner later confirmed she had died of multiple blunt force injuries and classified the death as a homicide. Investigators immediately began piecing together what had happened inside the house. Inside, there were signs of a struggle. On the back patio, police found traces of blood. In the bathroom, there were strong chemical smells, cleaning products, and bleach residue inside the bathtub drain, as though someone had tried to wash away evidence. The same day, detectives began searching for Sergio Brown. He was nowhere to be found. Neighbors told officers they hadn't seen him since 2 days earlier. One neighbor, who lived just a few doors down, mentioned seeing him at the home around the time Myrtle was last seen. Another recalled hearing raised voices that night. Police reviewed surveillance footage from nearby security cameras and discovered something unsettling. Around 11 p.m. on September 14th, Sergio was recorded near the backyard fire pit, tossing in what looked like fabric and setting it alight. When investigators later recovered the debris, they found partially burned pieces of clothing and household items. By this point, Sergio had vanished. Phone records showed that early on the morning of September 15th, he had booked a one-way flight to Cancun, Mexico, using his own credit card. An Uber driver picked him up at the house around 3 a.m. and dropped him off at O'Hare International Airport. He boarded his flight and left the country while his mother's body remained undiscovered behind the home. When Myrtle's death became public, the community's grief quickly turned into disbelief. News spread that the former football player was missing, and rumors swirled about his mental state. Some believed he might have been suffering from psychological problems. Others couldn't reconcile the man they knew, cheerful, respectful, and successful, with the son who was now the primary suspect in his mother's violent death. Investigators continued gathering evidence from the house and surrounding areas. DNA samples were collected from under Myrtle's fingernails, on cleaning supplies, and on items found near the fire pit. When compared with DNA from Sergio's toothbrush, lab results indicated a match or possible match. Detectives also recovered a plastic bag believed to have belonged to Sergio that contained Myrtle's cell phone, iPad, and credit cards. These findings painted a troubling picture. Not only had he possibly attacked her, but he had also taken her belongings before leaving the country. Meanwhile, Sergio began appearing on social media from Mexico, posting videos in which he denied any wrongdoing. In one clip, he spoke incoherently about the FBI and Maywood police framing him. His tone was erratic, at times mocking, at other times defensive. He didn't mention his mother's death directly, only referring vaguely to fake news. These clips were later cited by prosecutors as examples of his behavior and mindset following the crime. For weeks, authorities worked with international partners to locate him. On October 7, 2023, Mexican officials found Sergio Brown near Tulum and detained him. He was deported to the United States and flown to San Diego, where law enforcement took him into custody. From there, he was extradited to Illinois to face charges of first-degree murder and concealment of a homicide. When he arrived back in Maywood, reporters were waiting outside the police station as he was escorted in handcuffs. The hometown hero, once celebrated for his athleticism and success, now faced accusations of murdering the woman who had raised him. In court documents, prosecutors laid out the timeline. Myrtle was killed on the night of September 14th. Her body was hidden behind the house. Sergio fled the next morning, carrying her possessions and leaving behind evidence of cleanup attempts. The surveillance footage of him burning fabric, the DNA results, and the rapid flight to Mexico formed the foundation of the case against him. As details emerged, friends and relatives of Myrtle spoke publicly about her kindness and the deep love she had for her children. Her family described her as the backbone of the Browns, a warm, church-going woman who lived for her family. To them, it was impossible to imagine her son capable of such violence. The case felt like a collision between fame, family, and tragedy, the kind that exposes the hidden cracks beneath a seemingly ordinary home. The return of Sergio Brown to Illinois in October 2023 marked a turning point in the case. For weeks, Maywood had lived in suspense. A town that once celebrated him now watched as he was led into the Cook County Jail in a beige jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed, surrounded by deputies. Cameras followed every step. Reporters called his name, asking if he had killed his mother. He didn't answer. The same man once known for his confident, smiling presence on the football field now stood silent, staring ahead as if in a fog. Inside the courthouse, the first hearing was tense. Prosecutors laid out the early evidence in detail. The surveillance footage showing Sergio burning fabric behind the family home, the DNA that matched his own items collected from the scene, and the records proving he had fled to Mexico less than 12 hours after Myrtle's death. They described the house as a chaotic and violent crime scene. Blood on the back patio, chemical cleaners found in the bathroom, and signs that someone had tried to scrub surfaces. They said Myrtle's injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, her death classified as a homicide caused by multiple blows. Sergio's defense attorney entered a plea of not guilty. The argument was brief, that the prosecution had rushed to judgment, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that Sergio had not confessed or been witnessed committing the act. Still, the court denied bail. The judge called him a flight risk, given that he had already left the country once. Sergio showed little reaction to the decision. He stood still, his expression blank, occasionally glancing toward the floor as the hearing ended. Outside the courthouse, Myrtle's relatives spoke to reporters. Her sister described her as a loving mother who didn't deserve to die this way. Her nieces and nephews stood beside her, some in tears, asking for justice. The family thanked the police for their work, but admitted they still couldn't understand why it happened. "We just want to know why," her nephew said. "What could make him do something like this?" It was the question that would hang over the case long after that first day in court. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors began to fill in more details about Sergio's actions in the days before and after his mother's death. Witness statements revealed that neighbors had noticed unusual behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime. One neighbor said Sergio had become increasingly paranoid, sometimes pacing outside late at night, shouting that government agents were after him. Another said he had seen Sergio arguing with Myrtle on several occasions. Myrtle, known for her patience, had tried to calm him, but there was tension in the air. Investigators also found that in the months before the killing, Sergio had posted a series of erratic videos on social media. In some, he spoke about conspiracies, claiming his phone was tapped or that strangers were following him. After his mother's death, new videos appeared online, filmed in tropical locations, where he spoke directly to the camera, denying the accusations and making bizarre statements about being kidnapped by authorities or set up by the media. His tone swung from laughter to anger within seconds. These videos quickly circulated across the internet, fueling public debate about whether Sergio was suffering from a mental health crisis. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors didn't comment on his mental state but focused on the hard evidence. They described how Myrtle's credit cards and phone were used by Sergio in Mexico. Surveillance from Cancun's airport showed him wearing a white hat and sunglasses, traveling alone with a single bag. When Mexican police detained him weeks later, that same bag was recovered, and inside were several of Myrtle's personal belongings. This, prosecutors said, tied him directly to the crime and the attempt to flee responsibility. Back in Maywood, the community continued to grapple with the loss. Myrtle's funeral was held at the local church where she had been an active member. Friends and neighbors filled the pews, many wearing white to honor her memory. They spoke of her warmth, her smile, and how she never hesitated to help others. The pastor described her as a woman of faith who gave love even when she received pain. Her burial took place in a quiet cemetery not far from where she had lived her entire life. Sergio was not present. He sat in a Cook County jail cell awaiting trial. In the months that followed, both sides prepared their cases. The prosecution built a detailed timeline. Myrtle was last seen alive the evening of September 14, 2023. Around that time, Sergio was recorded burning items in the backyard. By early morning, he was en route to the airport, and by September 16th, Myrtle's body had been discovered. Forensic experts confirmed that DNA collected from beneath Myrtle's fingernails matched Sergio's genetic profile, suggesting a struggle. They also found bleach traces in multiple rooms, and the fire pit contained remnants of fabric that appeared to match clothing Myrtle was known to wear. The defense countered by suggesting there was no direct witness to the killing, and that DNA alone didn't prove intent or motive. They implied that Sergio's mental condition could have influenced his behavior, and that there was no confession linking him definitively to the act. The court filings hinted that the defense might later argue diminished capacity or psychological instability, though no formal insanity plea was entered at that time. While the legal process moved slowly, public interest in the case remained high. News outlets covered every update, describing the tragedy as another example of a famous athlete's fall from grace. Analysts on television debated what could drive a person to harm a parent. Some speculated that years of pressure and post-career struggles could have taken a toll on Sergio's mental health. Others said fame had nothing to do with it, that it was a domestic dispute that turned deadly. Through it all, the unanswered question of motive lingered. The prosecution maintained that Myrtle's killing was intentional. They pointed to the sequence of actions, the burning of evidence, the use of cleaning chemicals, and the sudden flight to another country. They argued that these were not the actions of a man in shock, but of someone trying to cover his tracks. They also highlighted the physical evidence, the blood traces, the fingernail DNA, and the possession of Myrtle's personal effects, as proof that Sergio was aware of what he was doing. Still, without a clear confession or a witness, the case rested heavily on circumstantial evidence. Detectives testified about the timeline, neighbors about what they heard, and forensic experts about what they found. Piece by piece, the prosecution aimed to show intent and concealment, while the defense sought to create doubt. By early 2024, after several preliminary hearings, a trial date was set. The courtroom became the center of attention once again. Reporters filled the benches. Myrtle's relatives sat in the front row, clutching photographs of her. The judge reminded everyone that the case would be decided on facts, not emotion. When the trial began, the prosecution led with its strongest evidence, the surveillance video and DNA results. Jurors watched the footage showing the backyard fire pit, the flickering flames, and a figure prosecutors said was Sergio burning fabric late at night. They listened to recordings of his social media rants and viewed photographs of the crime scene, the bleach bottles, and the bathtub drain. The defense urged the jury to look beyond the shock value. They argued there was no definitive proof of how Myrtle died, only assumptions built on fragmented evidence. They said Sergio's trip to Mexico wasn't an escape, but a reaction driven by confusion and mental distress. They suggested he loved his mother and would never deliberately harm her. But as the trial went on, the evidence became difficult to ignore. The jury heard from a forensic pathologist who described the extent of Myrtle's injuries, multiple blows to the head and face consistent with a physical assault. The autopsy revealed no signs of forced entry, indicating that her attacker was someone she trusted. That fact weighed heavily. Prosecutors reminded the jury that Sergio was the only person living in the house at the time. As days of testimony passed, the picture grew clearer. The timeline of events, the forensic proof, and the inconsistencies in Sergio's actions pointed toward guilt. Still, the defense continued to press the question of motive. Why would he do it? No clear reason emerged. There were no records of financial disputes, no known history of violence between them. It was as if the motive itself had been buried with Myrtle. By the time both sides rested their cases, the courtroom was silent. Sergio sat expressionless, occasionally whispering to his attorney. The prosecutors closed with a simple statement. He fled because he knew what he had done. The defense urged the jury to question every detail. When the judge adjourned for deliberation, the weight of the tragedy hung heavy in the air. Outside, the people of Maywood waited for the verdict that would decide the fate of their most famous son, a man once celebrated, now accused of the most unthinkable act. The next phase of the story would reveal whether justice would be served, and whether the truth behind Myrtle Brown's death would finally come to light. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Weeks of evidence, testimony, and speculation had built to this moment. Sergio Brown, once an admired athlete, now stood at the defendant's table, facing the consequences of a crime that had shattered his family and his community. The courtroom fell silent as the clerk read the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder and concealment of a homicide. Gasps echoed across the room. Myrtle Brown's relatives wept quietly, holding one another as the judge confirmed what many had already expected. Sergio sat motionless, his face unreadable, eyes fixed on the floor. The conviction was the culmination of months of investigation, testimony, and emotional strain. The prosecution had argued that the evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage placed Sergio at the scene, burning evidence just hours before fleeing to Mexico. DNA under Myrtle's fingernails matched his. His attempt to clean the crime scene with bleach, coupled with his disappearance and possession of her belongings, painted a picture of guilt that was difficult to refute. Prosecutors told the court that Sergio's actions after the murder showed clear intent to hide the crime. He didn't run because he was scared, the lead prosecutor said in closing. He ran because he knew what he had done. The defense tried to humanize him, describing a man unraveling under the weight of mental and emotional distress. They pointed to his erratic online behavior, his paranoid posts, and his apparent belief that people were after him. They insisted that he hadn't intended to harm his mother, that what happened was a result of mental instability, not deliberate malice. But in the end, the jury wasn't convinced. The physical evidence, the timeline, and his flight out of the country outweighed every claim of confusion or accident. In the weeks following the verdict, Myrtle's family spoke publicly for the first time since the trial ended. They thanked investigators and prosecutors for their persistence. "We miss her every day," one of her nieces said. "She was gentle and forgiving. She didn't deserve this." Another relative added that justice was necessary but never satisfying. "There's no closure for something like this," she said. "You can't fill the space a mother leaves behind." Their words reflected what many in Maywood felt, a mix of sorrow, disbelief, and lingering confusion about how a tragedy like this could have happened inside one family's home. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom filled once more. Prosecutors detailed Myrtle's final moments, emphasizing the brutality of the attack and Sergio's attempts to hide it. They described how she had been found near the creek behind her house, partially covered with leaves, and how the medical examiner had counted multiple blows to her head and face. The judge called the crime a shocking betrayal of trust, remarking on the tragedy of a son killing the very person who had given him everything. Sergio's defense attorney pleaded for leniency, citing his client's mental state and lack of prior criminal history. He argued that Sergio's decline had gone unnoticed and untreated. The judge acknowledged those concerns, but said that personal turmoil could not excuse such a violent act. Before sentencing, Sergio was allowed to speak. He stood, hands cuffed, looking thinner and older than when he first appeared in court months earlier. His voice was quiet but steady. He denied harming his mother, saying he loved her and still didn't understand what had happened. "My mother was my best friend," he said. "I didn't kill her. I wish I could change what people think, but I can't." His words hung in the air for a moment before the judge began to speak again, addressing the court about the evidence and the responsibility that comes with judgment. The sentence was delivered calmly, without pause. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted the callous disregard shown in Sergio's attempt to hide the crime and flee the country. Myrtle's family cried softly as the sentence was read. Some looked toward Sergio, others looked away. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobs of Myrtle's loved ones. Sergio was escorted out by deputies, his head lowered, his hands shackled. That was the last image the public saw of him, the hometown hero walking toward a lifetime behind bars. After the trial, reporters revisited Maywood to speak with neighbors who had known both mother and son. Many struggled to reconcile the man they remembered with the man convicted of such a violent crime. "He was always polite," one neighbor said. "You'd never think something like this could happen." Others said they had noticed his strange behavior in the months before the killing, but hadn't realized how serious it was. "He needed help," another resident said quietly. "It's just sad that no one saw how bad it had gotten until it was too late." For many, the case became a painful reminder of how quickly mental instability can spiral into tragedy if ignored. In the aftermath, Myrtle Brown's story became about more than just a crime. It became a story of a mother's love, a son's downfall, and a community forced to confront the fragile line between success and self-destruction. Myrtle had lived a full life, 73 years of family, faith, and friendship. Her death revealed the darkness that can exist even in familiar places, behind closed doors, in homes that seem peaceful from the outside. Sergio's journey, from celebrated athlete to convicted murderer, showed how far a person can fall when their mind turns against them. The tragedy left behind questions that may never be fully answered. Why did it happen? What triggered the violence that night? Was it rage, paranoia, or something deeper? Prosecutors never presented a clear motive because none was ever found. Sergio's mental evaluations didn't yield a single explanation that made sense of it all. In the end, the story wasn't about understanding why, but about the irreversible damage done. Months after the sentencing, Myrtle's relatives gathered at her grave, bringing flowers and small notes. They spoke softly about her kindness, her laughter, and the way she had always believed the best in people, even her son. Some said they had forgiven him. Others admitted they never could. The loss had carved a permanent space in their lives. As the sun set over the cemetery, her family stood quietly, united in grief, but also in love for the woman who had been taken from them too soon. Back in Maywood, the Brown house still stood on Chicago Avenue, its windows shuttered, its garden overgrown. The laughter and warmth that once filled it were gone, replaced by silence. Neighbors passed it every day, reminded of the story that had shaken their town. It had started as a mystery, evolved into a national headline, and ended as a tragic chapter in a family's history. The case of Sergio and Myrtle Brown became a haunting story of how quickly everything familiar can break apart. a mother who gave her life to her son, a son who lost himself to confusion and violence, and a small community that still asks how something so terrible could happen on their street. It's a story of love turned into loss, of fame turned into infamy, and of a family forever divided between memory and grief. In the heart of Houston, a picture-perfect family seemed untouchable until one quiet night shattered everything. A former NFL star and his wife were found shot in their bed, and the only witness was their teenage son. What really happened inside the Armstrong home that night remains chilling and unforgettable. It was a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood in Houston, Texas, where the Armstrong family lived, a family that seemed to have everything. Antonio Armstrong Sr., 42, was a former NFL linebacker, a man known for his discipline, charm, and commitment to family. His wife, Dawn Armstrong, was 42 as well, a loving mother and devoted wife who ran the household with care and order. Together, they had 2 children, their teenage son, Antonio A.J. Armstrong Jr., and his younger sister, Kyra. From the outside, they appeared to be the image of success and stability, a picture-perfect American family. But behind the closed doors of their modern, 3-story brick home, small cracks were starting to show, and over time, those cracks would grow into something unthinkable. Antonio Sr. had built a reputation not just as an athlete, but as a community figure. After his football career, he and Dawn opened a chain of fitness centers, often mentoring young athletes and encouraging discipline and faith. They were active in church, respected by friends, and admired for how they raised their children. To most who knew them, the Armstrongs represented what every family wanted to be: close, successful, and guided by faith. But life at home was becoming more complicated, especially with AJ, their teenage son, who was struggling to find his place. AJ was 16 years old in 2016, a high school student and a basketball player at a private Christian academy. To outsiders, he was polite, charming, and well-liked. But inside the Armstrong home, his parents were growing increasingly frustrated. He had begun experimenting with marijuana, lying about his whereabouts, and ignoring household rules. His mother, Dawn, kept a close eye on him, trying to pull him back toward discipline and responsibility. She often texted him reminders to behave or scolded him for disobeying curfews. What once were typical teenage problems soon became daily clashes between mother and son. Tension in the household rose as AJ continued testing boundaries. His father, though strict, believed in tough love and guidance. Antonio Sr. saw potential in his son. He often reminded AJ that discipline had brought him success in sports and life. But as AJ slipped further into rebellion, those lessons seemed to fall on deaf ears. Dawn, a protective mother who had always fought to keep her family grounded, began to lose patience. Text messages later uncovered by investigators showed her deep frustration. She accused AJ of being dishonest, disrespectful, and ungrateful. Still, she loved him fiercely and wanted him to change course before it was too late. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, their home was filled with both normal family activity and rising tension. AJ's grades were falling, and his parents grounded him more than once. He had been caught sneaking out, lying about where he was going, and even playing with his father's gun. In one instance, he accidentally fired a bullet through the floor of his bedroom, leaving a hole that went through the ceiling of his parents' room below. The incident terrified Dawn, who feared that her son was becoming careless and dangerous. Antonio Sr. was furious. The gun was locked away after that, and AJ was told never to touch it again. But the hole in the ceiling, symbolic and literal, would later become a chilling piece of evidence. On the night of July 28, 2016, the family went through their usual routine. Dawn and Antonio Sr. spent the evening at home, while AJ and his sister settled in for the night. Sometime after midnight, while the house slept, something happened that would shatter their world forever. At 1:40 a.m., a 911 call came from the Armstrong home. The voice on the line was young and frightened. It was AJ. He told the dispatcher that he had heard gunshots from his parents' bedroom and believed an intruder had entered the house. When police arrived at the upscale Houston home, they found a scene that didn't fit the story. Dawn Armstrong was found shot in her bed, lifeless. Antonio Sr. was still alive, but gravely wounded, shot once in the head. He was rushed to the hospital, but despite doctors' efforts, he died a few hours later. The family's once peaceful home had become a crime scene. A.J. stood outside when officers arrived. He appeared shaken and confused. He told them that a masked man had broken into the house, shot his parents, and fled. Investigators began searching for signs of forced entry, but there were none. The alarm system had been armed that night, and there was no indication that anyone had entered or exited the home without disarming it. Every window and door was intact. Nothing had been stolen. Police began to suspect that whoever shot Antonio and Dawn hadn't come from outside. Inside the home, detectives found a .22 caliber pistol lying on the kitchen counter, neatly placed on a white towel. It was the same gun Antonio Sr. owned, the same one A.J. had fired before. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, only a faint impression that had been wiped clean. Upstairs, investigators noticed the bullet hole in A.J.'s bedroom floor from the earlier incident. They also found evidence that suggested A.J. might have been awake when the shots were fired, not asleep as he claimed. Detectives interviewed A.J. that night. His story was detailed but didn't line up with what they found. He claimed he woke up to the sound of gunfire and saw smoke rising from under his bedroom door. He said he smelled gunpowder and went downstairs, where he discovered his parents shot. But the timeline didn't add up. The house alarm showed no signs of an intruder entering, and A.J.'s description of a masked gunman lacked specifics. His sister, sleeping nearby, hadn't heard or seen anyone else either. In the following days, the investigation focused entirely on the Armstrong home. The police questioned neighbors, reviewed security data, and rechecked every detail. Dawn and Antonio Sr. had no enemies, no financial troubles, and no reason for anyone to want them dead. Their social life revolved around church, business, and family. That left only one possible explanation. The killer was someone inside the home. As detectives pieced together the family's recent history, A.J.'s behavior drew more attention. They learned about his trouble in school, his arguments with his parents, and his growing defiance. Text messages between Dawn and her friends revealed her fear that A.J. was getting out of control. One message, sent just days before her death, said she didn't know what to do with him anymore. The image of a happy family began to blur as the truth of their home life came into focus. Investigators also examined A.J.'s digital activity from the night of the murders. His phone had been unplugged from its charger around 1:08 a.m., about half an hour before the 911 call. They found no calls or messages to suggest he had been contacting anyone outside the house. The only communication was the call to emergency services after the shots were fired. Within weeks, suspicion hardened into accusation. A.J. Armstrong, just 16 years old, was charged with the murder of his parents. The news sent shockwaves through Houston. The idea that a well-known, respected family could end in such tragedy was almost impossible for the community to accept. Friends and neighbors struggled to believe that the same boy they had seen smiling at church or playing basketball could be responsible for something so violent. But prosecutors believed the evidence told a different story. They claimed A.J. had become angry at his parents, particularly his mother, who had been enforcing stricter rules and grounding him for weeks. They said he planned the attack late at night, shot them while they slept, and then tried to stage the scene to look like a break-in. The gun, placed carefully on the counter, seemed to support that theory. It looked more like a display than a discarded weapon. A.J.'s defense attorney argued that the police rushed to judgment. They said there was no direct evidence linking A.J. to the shooting, no confession, and no eyewitness. They suggested the possibility of an unknown intruder and pointed out that A.J.'s fingerprints were not found on the gun. But the case was already moving toward trial, and the details surrounding that night were about to be examined under a microscope. The Armstrong home, once filled with laughter, was now an empty shell, a reminder of what had been lost. For Houston police, it was one of the most heartbreaking cases they had ever handled. A respected father and mother dead, and their teenage son accused of killing them. The story that began as a tragic mystery was now becoming a courtroom drama, one that would take years to finally reach its conclusion. As A.J. sat in juvenile detention awaiting trial, the community remained divided. Some believed he was innocent, a boy wrongly accused in a moment of chaos. Others believed the evidence was clear and that the once promising young man had committed an unthinkable act against his own family. The truth would not be easy to uncover, and what came next would reveal how complicated, emotional, and relentless the fight for justice could be. In the months that followed the murders, the Armstrong case became one of Houston's most discussed tragedies. News outlets covered every update. Neighbors whispered about what could have gone wrong inside that perfect home, and the community struggled to understand how a family that seemed so grounded in faith and love could fall apart so violently. At the center of it all was Antonio A.J. Armstrong, Jr., the teenager who had once been known for his smile and calm demeanor, now accused of killing the people who had given him everything. From the beginning, A.J. maintained his innocence. He said he loved his parents and would never hurt them. He told detectives again and again that someone else must have entered the house that night. But the evidence didn't support his story. Investigators found no broken windows, no forced doors, no fingerprints belonging to anyone outside the family. The home's alarm system showed it had been armed from inside. There were no signs of a struggle. Everything suggested that the killer had been someone who already lived there. For detectives, the case was frustrating and tragic. They weren't dealing with hardened criminals, but a family that had once been admired across the city. Antonio Armstrong Sr. had coached young athletes, often speaking to kids about making good choices. He and Dawn had opened their home to friends and relatives, sharing dinners and church events. The idea that their son could be responsible was something that investigators themselves struggled to accept. Still, every lead they followed came back to him. Evidence from the scene painted a clear picture. The .22 caliber pistol used in the murders belonged to Antonio Sr., and it had been kept in a drawer near his bed. Forensic testing showed that the gun had been wiped clean, but not perfectly. Small traces of gunpowder residue were found in A.J.'s room. On his clothing, detectives found a visitor's badge from a local school with tiny brown stains that would later test positive for blood matching his father's. At the time, however, that discovery wasn't fully processed, and prosecutors knew their case would rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. In 2017, as A.J. prepared to face trial, prosecutors began piecing together his motive. They believed the killings stemmed from months of frustration, punishment, and anger at home. A.J. had been grounded repeatedly. His mother had taken away his phone, restricted his activities, and even discussed sending him to live elsewhere if his behavior didn't change. To prosecutors, this showed a growing divide between mother and son. They believed the tension built until it exploded into violence one early morning in July. The defense told a different story. A.J.'s lawyers said there was no physical evidence linking him directly to the shootings. They reminded the jury that there were no fingerprints, no confession, and no eyewitnesses. They also brought up other theories, including one about possible break-ins in the neighborhood. They even suggested that A.J.'s teenage half-brother, who had struggled with mental health issues, might have been involved, though that claim lacked any support. In April 2019, the first trial began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and curious spectators. The Armstrong name carried weight in Houston, and the tragedy had drawn intense attention. Prosecutors presented the timeline carefully. They walked the jury through the alarm data, the gun evidence, and the digital activity on A.J.'s phone. They emphasized that the family's alarm system showed no entry or exit during the critical hours. They played A.J.'s 911 call, pointing out moments where his tone seemed rehearsed. To them, it wasn't the voice of someone in shock. It was someone trying to sound like it. A.J.'s defense lawyer countered by saying the prosecution was relying on assumptions. He told the jury that A.J. was just a frightened teenager who had woken up to chaos and called for help. He said police rushed to blame the easiest target because they couldn't find anyone else. The defense also noted that A.J. had cooperated fully with investigators, never tried to run, and never changed his story. When the jury began deliberations, no one could predict what would happen. After several days, they returned deadlocked. Some believed A.J. was guilty, others were not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge declared a mistrial. A.J. was sent home on bond, ordered to stay under supervision. For the Armstrong family, that verdict changed everything. Dawn and Antonio's relatives remained divided. Some supported A.J., while others couldn't forgive what they believed he had done. A.J.'s grandmother, who had taken him in, spoke publicly about her faith in his innocence. She said the system had failed him and that the truth would come out in time. Prosecutors, however, promised to try again. They believed the case was too strong to drop. In 2022, the second trial began. Once again, the same evidence was presented, but this time the defense emphasized the lack of DNA and fingerprints even more strongly. They told the jury that investigators had built a story without proof, and that A.J. had been unfairly targeted because of his behavior as a teenager. The prosecution repeated its argument about motive, saying A.J.'s frustration with his parents had turned into rage. They reminded jurors that Dawn had been shot twice in her bed, both bullets fired from close range, and that Antonio Sr. had been shot in the head while sleeping beside her. Whoever did it knew them intimately. After days of testimony, the second jury also failed to reach a unanimous decision. It was another mistrial. For A.J., it was another temporary victory, but not freedom. The district attorney's office immediately announced that they would pursue a third trial. By then, 6 years had passed since the murders. A.J. was no longer a teenager, but a young man in his 20s. He had been living under constant scrutiny, unable to move forward, his life frozen in the shadow of that night. The case had become a test of patience for everyone involved. Prosecutors continued to review evidence, looking for anything that could strengthen their argument. The defense prepared for another fight, confident that 2 mistrials showed the jury system didn't believe in the state's case. What made the case so haunting was the absence of clear answers. There was no confession, no witness, and no video. Everything came down to small pieces: the alarm, the gun, the blood traces, and the behavior of one teenager who claimed to be innocent. The question remained: if A.J. didn't do it, who did? And if he did, why? In the years between trials, A.J. gave interviews where he expressed disbelief at the accusations. He talked about his parents with affection, calling them his heroes. He said he still woke up thinking about them, and that the only thing he wanted was for people to know he didn't do it. But prosecutors saw those statements as a performance, an effort to gain sympathy before facing a jury again. By the time the third trial approached in 2023, investigators had re-examined every piece of evidence from the crime scene. Forensic technology had advanced, and tests that were once inconclusive now offered new details. It was that evidence, small, precise, and scientific, that would finally break the stalemate and lead to a verdict. The Armstrong case, long marked by uncertainty, was heading toward a resolution that would determine whether Antonio A.J. Armstrong Jr. would walk free or spend his life behind bars. By the summer of 2023, 7 years had passed since the night Antonio and Dawn Armstrong were killed in their Houston home. The case had been tried twice before, both ending in mistrials, and the community had grown used to living in the shadow of uncertainty. People wondered if justice would ever be served, or if the truth would stay buried in conflicting testimony and doubt. When the third trial began, it carried the weight of everything that had come before: years of speculation, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. This time, prosecutors came prepared with new forensic evidence that hadn't been available during the earlier trials. The most critical piece came from the small visitor's badge A.J. had been wearing on the night of the murders. Tiny reddish-brown stains on the sticker were retested using advanced DNA technology. The results revealed that the blood belonged to Antonio Armstrong Sr. It was a finding prosecutors described as a breakthrough, something that tied A.J. physically to the scene in a way that previous trials could not prove. Along with that, they presented refined data from the home's alarm system and AJ's phone records. The prosecution laid out a sequence they said left no room for doubt. According to their timeline, AJ's phone had been unplugged at around 1:08 a.m., roughly 30 minutes before he called 911. The alarm system had remained armed the entire time, meaning no one had entered or exited the house. They said AJ went downstairs quietly, took his father's gun from the drawer, and shot his parents as they slept. Don was hit first, twice in the head. Antonio Sr. was shot once, but still alive when emergency services arrived. Afterward, prosecutors said AJ staged the scene to look like a break-in, placing the gun neatly on a towel in the kitchen, and then making the 911 call in a calm, deliberate tone. The prosecution also returned to the family's private tensions. They read text messages between AJ and his parents that showed a pattern of conflict and disappointment. In one exchange, Dawn scolded her son for lying again. In another, she expressed fear over his behavior. The prosecution described the Armstrong household as a place of rising frustration, parents trying to enforce discipline, a son resisting control, and the tension that slowly consumed their relationship. Witnesses testified about the Armstrongs' life before the murders. Friends and relatives spoke of Antonio Sr. as a man devoted to his family and faith, a mentor who believed in structure and responsibility. Dawn was described as warm but firm, a mother who expected the best from her children. Those who knew AJ described him as intelligent but moody, a teenager who often felt misunderstood. The prosecution argued that those mixed emotions, combined with anger over punishment and pressure at home, created a storm that ended in violence. The defense countered with a familiar message. There was no direct evidence that AJ pulled the trigger. They said the DNA evidence on the visitor's badge was trace level and could have been transferred in any number of ways. They questioned the reliability of the forensic analysis, reminding the jury that it was conducted years after the murders. They argued that the absence of fingerprints on the gun, the lack of gunshot residue on AJ's hands, and the limited amount of blood found on him suggested he wasn't the shooter. The defense described AJ as a frightened teenager trapped in a nightmare, not a calculating killer. For the first time, AJ took the stand. Now in his 20s, he appeared calm, but visibly tense, as he recounted the night of the murders. He said he woke to the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke, ran from his room, and found his parents' door open. He insisted he never fired the gun and had no idea who could have done it. His voice cracked as he described seeing his parents shot, and for a moment, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of his own tears. But the prosecution's cross-examination was relentless. They pressed him on every inconsistency, from the alarm data to the placement of the gun. They asked why no one else in the house had heard or seen an intruder. They questioned his calmness during the 911 call, suggesting that he sounded rehearsed rather than panicked. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The jury had watched the young man's every move, weighing each word against the evidence. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury once more. The courtroom was filled with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers. The jurors deliberated for 17 hours before reaching a decision. On August 16, 2023, they returned to the courtroom. The foreman stood and announced the verdict: guilty of capital murder. A.J. Armstrong, the once promising son of 2 respected parents, was convicted of killing them as they slept. There was silence in the courtroom as the words sank in. Some family members sobbed quietly, others stared ahead, expressionless. A.J. sat still, his face pale, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Because he was 16 at the time of the murders, he was not eligible for the death penalty. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 40 years. He would be nearly 60 by the time he could seek release. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as prosecutors called the verdict long overdue. They said it had taken 7 years and 3 trials, but justice for Antonio and Dawn Armstrong had finally been served. A.J.'s defense team vowed to appeal, arguing that the new forensic evidence had been misinterpreted. His grandmother stood outside the courthouse, her voice shaking as she said she still believed in his innocence. For Houston, the case closed one of its most painful chapters. The story of the Armstrong family, a story once defined by faith, success, and love, had become a reminder of how fragile that image can be. The bright future of a teenage boy had collided with the legacy of two parents who had dedicated their lives to him. And when the final verdict came, it left behind a haunting truth. No matter how perfect a family may seem from the outside, what happens behind closed doors can change everything.